Hi, we come to the conclusion of 1 Samuel 28 today, after the woman of Endor has raised Samuel from the dead to respond to Saul's query for help, and Samuel says again, Yahweh has rejected you, go away. Well, he didn't actually say go away, and in fact we don't know what happened to Samuel. After he's brought up and we see something like an Elohim a couple of videos ago, we noticed that, then we just hear that it's Samuel, although there's no description of him, and there's no description of him leaving or fading away or anything. For as far as we know, the dead Samuel is still standing there, but he's not in the story, and the story now will focus on the woman turning to Saul and telling him to listen to her. So to set our context again, we're in the chiastic structure of the second half of 1 Samuel, and we're in the green part here, finishing up this section, parallel up here to the question of Saul among the prophets, and here is Saul among the prophets, Samuel. And we've also been looking at how our chapter here is part of the sandwich structure that we saw first from chapters 24 to 26, and now chapters 27 to 29, with this story in the middle. And as a result of that, we see that the sequence, the chronological sequence and the location sequence, is not the way it follows in the biblical text itself, but chapter 29 and 30 are at one time period, and then chapter 28 and 31 are simultaneous. So while David is down and recovering his wives and the property of all the people in Ziklag down here, Saul was up here somewhere in Endor. We don't know really where Endor is, but it's somewhere in that region, negotiating with Samuel, and then will come down here to Gilboa to fight his final battle to the death. And as many scholars have noted, that narrative setup is designed to make sure that readers believe that David was not directly responsible for the death of Saul. But as we see in the beginning of 2 Samuel, there's still some clues, and we'll look back to hear some clues from earlier to suggest even if David wasn't directly responsible for it, he may be indirectly responsible for the death of Saul. And we already saw that a little bit in the end of chapter 30 when he took the spoils and distributed them to a network of the elders of Judah, suggesting he's preparing to get ready to take his reign. So we've also been looking at the key words, and there aren't a lot of key words in this last section other than listen. That is certainly the key word here. Listen, 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 as well as the woman of Saul. But probably more important beyond that, although listening is certainly important, is how this chapter continues to show an intratextual echoing throughout all of 1 Samuel, so that the end of Saul's life is reflecting on his entire life. We saw that explicitly last time with Samuel's explicitly calling back the story from chapter 15, but there are many other elements of that, and we see those here. And so we'll look at those in detail as we go. So let's just jump into our section, and as we do, we'll see that scholars have a wide range of views of what the woman is trying to do here. Just to start with the range, is she being kind and gentle and hospitable, or is she desperately trying to keep Saul from killing her, given the bad news here? What is her purpose and her method? And actually, what is she offering? So we'll have to look carefully at that as we go. So we begin here in verse 21. After we'd heard that from the narrator there was no strength in Saul, he'd fallen full down his full length and eat nothing all day and night. So we see our response here. As my note below has, she now must face down the king who has just been given a death sentence by the only voice he trusts, knowing that he could order his own death. Pamela Reese argues the meal that follows is her attempt to save her life and her job. And we'll see throughout this section that Pamela Reese has certainly the most radical interpretation of this, that there's not hospitality in her part, but a desperate attempt to placate Saul and to save her life. Not many scholars have followed her into the final conclusion we'll see about the calf, but they have not given any reasons for it. So it's very interesting that it may just be they find her conclusion disgusting personally, because a number have just simply said, I can't go as far as Reese, but they don't give any reason why. So you can decide for yourself. It begins with this verb right here. The woman came to Saul using vadavo, and she suggests it came into, which has a sexual connotation, and she suggests the translation comes onto, that she's trying to seduce Saul here, at least gently, in order to persuade him not to kill her. That's one possibility, but again, few scholars have followed that. And when she saw that he was terrified, echoing what we saw earlier in the chapter, that he was afraid, and the opposite of what Saul told her back in verse 13, to not be afraid, but she can see it all over his face, and certainly even more terrified now that Samuel told him that tomorrow would be the last day of his life. She said to him, your servant, omitting the Hannah behold here, and note the little ABA chiasm in the first part of her speech here around listen to, and we'll look at the details to see there's more that the translation doesn't show. Your servant, shifka here, not the female word for a servant here, there and again in verse 22 where she refers to that. That echoes Hannah earlier, although that's not one of the echoes I showed here. As I was noting in the previous couple of videos, this chart of intratextual echoes could be 3 times longer if I put every one of them in there. So it's echoing Hannah up here, what kings do, take your servants, your female servants, in 8:16, and Abigail we saw earlier. But we'll see it especially here. We can jump ahead to that here. This is the story of the woman of Tekoa, who Joab gets to tell David the little parable that he begins to understand is about Absalom and Amnon. But we'll get there when we get there. But another woman who is enlisted to help a king. Your servant has listened to you, but literally to your sound or voice, using the Hebrew kol there, Q-O-L is the root word. So listen to you or your voice, literally heard. I have taken my life in my hand, and given that hand as keyword, this isn't hand, this is palm, as we see here. And it echoes from chapter 19. David took his life in his palm when he attacked the Philistine. So she's taken her life in her palm and have listened to what you have said, literally to the word you spoke to me. So the first part of the ABA chiasm is I've heard your voice and taken my life in my hand at the center, and then I've heard your words. And of course she responded to his words. His words were to bring up Saul, and also his word that there'd be no guilt on her for doing what he himself had prohibited in supposedly expelling people like her. So she continues, now therefore you also listen to your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you. Eat that you may have strength when you go on your way. And my note below highlights the divergence of views among a couple of scholars. Stussy suggests her human kindness toward a man on the brink of death stands in sharp contrast to Yahweh's abandonment and Samuel's bitterness. But Reese says, I think it is far from realistic to suppose that a menaced and evidently terrified woman overlooks the mortal danger her worst enemy inflicts upon her and becomes his gracious hostess. Indeed, in such a predicament, a response of eager hospitality would be bizarre. It is more true to life for a frightened, hunted, and condemned person to try to outwit and outmaneuver her adversary to save her own life than to try to feed him to save and fortify his. And yet, the narrator tells us nothing about her fear. Reese is certainly inferring her fear from the fact that the king has been told by Samuel that he's going to die tomorrow, and certainly somebody powerful who's afraid can be dangerous. But we simply hear nothing about fear from her, and she certainly seems to be very clear in what she's doing. So whether she's afraid or not, Reese's point still may be valid. It may not be that she's trying to provide hospitality like Abraham and Sarah, to whom this first part of the scene is very parallel, as I'll show you in a minute. But the context is what's different. So let's look at the details of what she says here, and then we'll look at the story from chapter 18 in Genesis. So listen, literally hear, please. Saul's not listening has plagued him throughout his reign. And as Reese adds again, it is not appropriate for a woman, and especially a woman so low in the social order, to set the terms for a king. The witch's proposition is expressed with intelligence, delicacy, and tact. And the fact that she's so low in the social order is certainly true, but Saul is literally lying on the ground when she's addressing this to him. So he's not so high in the social order at the moment. And she says, let me set a morsel of bread, pot lechem here, recalling ironically 236, as we see here on the right side of the screen. Everyone who is left in Eli's family shall come to implore the future priest for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and shall say, please put me in one of the priest's places that I may eat a morsel of bread. Just say a tiny little bit. So parallel there. Eat that you may have strength, channeling the narrator from verse 20, who told us that Saul had no strength, but she didn't hear it out loud, but she can plainly see it when you go on your way. And so what's her purpose here? If we look at the scene right now, you can see it in comparison with Genesis 18, 5-7, and you see the parallels there, both with a little bit of bread and with the calf that you can see on the left side of the screen down here, although the words are different, and you can see the parallels as well. But one of the differences is in Genesis it says the servant prepared the calf. And we'll look at the difference when we get to that verse down in verse 24. But also different is the context. Abraham and Sarah here are providing hospitality for strangers in the heat of the day in the middle of the desert. So their hospitality is necessary, or these people would just die. It's the general rule of supporting people who are visitors out in the desert or outside of cities. But this is not that context. Saul has his 2 men. His hunger is simply because he's refused to eat, and as we'll see in next verse, you can see right now, he still refuses to eat. So he's not a stranger in need of hospitality. He's a king who's been given bad news, and he's at her place not seemingly randomly like the visitors to Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 18, but intentionally to get her to do something that he has banned. So the context is very different, and not suggesting, as Reese suggests, that hospitality is at issue. But if it's not hospitality, what is it? So we need to continue to see that. And let's scroll down to get the rest of our passage on the screen so we can follow the rest of our scene here. So, as Hamori notes here, Saul's response is the response of a petulant child, too hungry to get up to eat and too distraught to be comforted. So we hear, he refused, using the opposite of amen here. Amen means like so be it, and this is like so be it not. And again, we see the an echo from 2:23 in Samuel. We can see that here. This is actually in 2 Samuel. He refused to turn away, and Abner struck him in the stomach. And so we'll get to that story later. So another refusal upon an invitation. But Pamela Reese suggests below that this argues that Saul refuses because he understands she is offering to conduct a ritual that might save his life and thus save her own from him. Why would that make him refuse? Because in Reese's view, he's planning to kill her for being the bad messenger. And we'll see how that plays out when we see in 2 Samuel 1 and 2, when David does a similar thing to an Amalekite messenger who brings news of Saul's death. So that's not far off from the immediate context here. But he continues, I will not eat. But his servants, together with the woman, notice the little conspiracy of the two men with him and the woman, urged him. This is an unusual word for urge. It's not the same word for what Lot does to the visitors to Sodom in chapter 19, echoed in the story of the road to Emmaus, at least in the Septuagint and the Greek in Luke 24, for urging someone to eat and to stay in their hospitality because it's dangerous out in the streets of a city. This is a different word and literally means burst out here. And we see another example of it in 2 Samuel 13:25 and 27. Let's look at it there. The king said to Absalom, this is just before Absalom's rebellion, no, my son, let us not all go, or we will be burdensome to you. And he pressed him, the same word here for burst out. So literally we might say they burst in on him, or they broke his bubble, something like that, and he listened to their words. So as she said she listened to his words, now he's finally listening to their words. So he got up from the ground and then sat on the bed. And notice Reese suggests many thematic parallels with the scene from 2 Samuel 12:20, which is everything about Bathsheba. But we'll look at those comparisons when we get there. So sat on the bed, and noting that bed is a very unusual word in 1 Samuel. We only see it in chapter 19, as we see here, when Michal protected David from her father Saul by putting the teraphim in the bed and covering it with cloths and with goat hair, as we see here. And then we'll see it in 2 Samuel when Saul's son Ishmael was lying on the bed, and one of the sons that gets killed we see there. So echoing from the past and anticipating in the future two situations of potential death while sitting on a bed. But Reese suggests now that the teraphim lineage there is all the way through here, from Rachel in Genesis to Jacob in Genesis 49:33 and Jacob's death to Michal to here. Could be, but also maybe not. But she notes the intimacy of him sitting on the bed in her house there as part of her suggestion that she's trying to seduce him. So we see here in 24, my note is just further noting the echoes from Genesis 18. The woman had a fatted calf, and although fatted calf seems like a biblical image, it's actually quite rare. We see it once in Jeremiah and once in Amos. In Genesis we hear, as you saw, a calf tender and good, but it's not the same word either for fatted or for calf. But this certainly means something special, a calf that's been preserved for a special occasion. But then there's the odd description that it's in the house. And plainly, she wouldn't be keeping the calf in her house, I don't think. That certainly wasn't the case for people, but it must suggest within her control that she has one within her household. And she quickly, hurriedly here, again, another echo like Abraham and Sarah, but also immediately echoing Saul's hurry to fall on the ground. And here's something really important, and this is where Reese really makes a point, and we see it down here. The New RSV has slaughtered it, but as she notes that of 129 uses of this term in the Masoretic text, which is to say the Hebrew text, 127 of them indicate ritual sacrifice. So she suggests that slaughter is exactly the wrong word here, that sacrifice is at issue. And as Bodner notes, writing before she wrote her piece, he says the faulty sacrifice back in chapter 15 around the Amalekites drives Saul to reject a despair in the first place, and now an aberrant sacrifice is his last meal. So what is the point of this sacrifice? Well, we have to keep going to here, at least what Reese's suggestion is. And then she took flour, again echoing Genesis 18:6 as we saw, kneaded it, yet again echoing Genesis 18:6, and only one other time in here where cakes are being kneaded for Amnon seducing his half-sister, and baked matzah here as Lot does for the visitors there. So another connection, which would make it seem like it's hospitality, but except for the sacrifice scene. You would not be sacrificed something if it's hospitality. And there's another point that Reese makes here, and let's look at the note down below that she suggests. She says there's no word like we saw in Genesis for prepared it. So she suggests that although it notes that the flour is baked in the matzah, the meat is not, and suggests it was eaten raw with the blood as a grisly sort of sacrifice that Saul is taking part in. And that's the part that many scholars find that they can't follow. But again, no reason given other than it seems despicable. But is that what she's doing? It's not 100% clear, so you can decide for yourself. And we get to our final verse here as she notes the communal meal performs the legal function of a treaty in establishing a meal. And we'll see a similar thing between Laban and Jacob in Genesis, in our Genesis series, among the many echoes of the Saul-David story and the book of Genesis. She put them before Saul using the word that's not pronounceable without vowels down here, but in the hifal stem, which suggests an approach to, a drawing near. So put is plainly wrong here. She suggests it's a loaded verb that connotes both the priestly approach to the altar and sexual intercourse. And it is that sometimes, but in all these other uses in 1 Samuel it's not. We can look at one, just an example from 13:9, where Saul says, "Bring the burnt offerings to me and the offerings of well-being," and he did. And so that's a sacrifice there, but Saul is not a priest, and there's certainly nothing sexual about that. And also less fraught context here in Genesis, where it's simply approaching somebody. So that perhaps is why some scholars think that Reese is reaching, although they don't necessarily note this point. So she put them before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Notice it's not suggesting she ate with them, although they could include them. If it was a treaty, it would certainly seem like both parties to the treaty would need to eat. And then there's these three quick verbs. They ate, rose, and went away, just like Esau back here in Genesis 25:34, as we see the same three verbs in a row: ate, drank, and went on his way. So suggesting as Esau goes away from Jacob, angry but satisfied in a deal that he made, perhaps this meal is offering a parallel to that there. They rose and went away that night, framing with verse 8. And so after this now we'll jump to chapter 31, where Saul will meet the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, but he'll face his fate there. And the challenge for us as readers will be, this chapter 31 has one version of Saul's death, and 1 Samuel 1 has another. We'll get there next time. See you then. Bye-bye.